And we're back. Second interview since the launch or the relaunch of PodLogic. The first one went super well with Tyler O'Shea talking about SEO. And today we are with Hector Santiesteban, host of the show Marketing Your Podcast. Hector, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, dude. I'm excited. We just spent an episode. We just did an episode recording on my show, and now we're here. I feel like, I don't know, we should have a ribbon or a star or a badge or something. I don't know. This should be a cool accomplishment.
Well, we lucked out by doing your podcast first because we got warmed up. So now we're like in the flow of doing things for my podcast. So definitely go check out Marketing Your Podcast. I think it's a great show. And Hector, the reason I wanted to bring him on was he really hits on something that's not really my area of expertise. When I work with people, or the content that I put out is more about like getting started, getting your podcast up and running. Here's what microphone you should use. Here's the camera that you should use. Here's ways to like talk to your guests before you actually interview them. Things like that, sort of like in the weeds things. But you talk a lot about marketing and growth. And something when I was cruising your Twitter, because that's how we got connected, you mentioned that relationships are more important than downloads when it comes to determining the success of your podcast. What do you mean by that?
I have one host. We started the show back in May, and I don't know, I think we just passed the 3,000 download mark. So, we're not breaking any records. We're not topping any charts, but over those, we're now about 50 episodes in. Over those 50 episodes, we've had, billionaires, world-renowned authors, Olympic medalists, people that would otherwise think that those guests would not go on a show that quote unquote small. And so that's the first part. And the second part is that in addition to that, this host is also, in addition to kind of leveraging it into some great guests, has also turned it into some incredible business opportunities for himself. And so if he would have come in focusing on the fact that, each episode gets downloaded, I don't know, 30, 40, whatever, I guess, 100 times maybe over the course of its lifetime, it's not that exciting. And so I think that we talked about on my show that managing expectations is so important, but I find that especially early on, and I would imagine that even as the show grows, that those relationships that people can build either with your guests or with your listeners early on are way more valuable than seeing that download number go from 50 to 100 to 200 to whatever, right? If there's no real relationships behind those numbers, it's kind of an empty metric, especially in podcasting where you don't see the comments, you don't really see the likes. There's no face to your community necessarily from the podcast app. There are kind of other ways to do that, but unless you're out seeking and building and creating those relationships, they're not going to be apparent to you.
Dude, that's a freaking awesome way to put it. I think if you had to put it into one sentence, and this is something that I use a lot, is it's quality over quantity. Whether that is the types of guests that you're having on or the number of listeners that you have, the quality of, and I equate it more to like your audience. The quality of your audience is way more important than the quantity of your audience. And that kind of ties into something that I wanted to talk about next, which is monetization. So if you look at just from a pure numbers standpoint, and these are going to be extreme cases, not everyone gets to monetize their podcast. It's just the fact of life. If you are selling a $25,000 course, or you have Dollar Shave Club breaking down your door wanting to sell you for a $10 CPM, the money difference between those two is vast. And I would much rather be in the camp of I have 150 people downloading my podcast and that 2 of them buy my $25,000 course versus having 2,000 listeners an episode and only getting like $50 from hawking Dollar Shave Club products to them. And monetization is something that you talk about a lot on podcast or on Twitter specifically. I don't know how much you go with it into your podcast, but for my audience, which is people that are early into their podcasting career or want to just learn more about it, in terms of monetization, it's not for everybody. It's not going to happen for everybody. But from your experience, is there any low-hanging fruit, maybe like 1 or 2 things that the average podcaster can do to either monetize or even just inch them closer to monetization?
Yeah, I'd say if you have your own business, I'd imagine that a lot of people that listen to the show or that you work with have their own business, or they're starting the podcast as a part of their business. I think that is the best way, right? That I put it out. It seemed to do pretty well on Twitter. It seemed to people seem to resonate with it. But that's that. If your product is your podcast, it's going to be really hard to monetize that. But if your podcast is your marketing, or is part of your marketing, or it can even be leveraged as part of the sales process, the follow-up process. It can be used to warm up leads. It can be used to close clients. Like, it can really be leveraged in a lot of different ways. But if you're using the podcast to sell something else, you have a lot more leverage. It can be a lot more valuable. Whereas if in the Dollar Shave Club example, if your podcast is the product and that's actually what you're selling, well, you're actually selling your audience to Dollar Shave Club. And in that regard, that's that's where you're getting the least form of value, in my opinion, both for you in terms of the dollars that you're making, and also that's the lowest form of value for your listeners, because, well, not all cases. There are some great products and there's some great sponsors out there, but I'm of the mind that you can really leverage that relationship to provide a lot more value than selling, pills or whatever, razors.
No, I think that's a great point. And that's such a, like, that line is just sticking in my head of, if your podcast is your product and not your marketing, or make your podcast your marketing, not your product. I think that's something that just kind of goes over people's heads. They start the podcast going, I'm going to sell this show and I'm going to be this huge famous person. And then it's like, no, it's such an easier path to quote unquote success of using the podcast as a vehicle to indirectly drive money into your bank account. And that can be done through a dozen different ways. And you went through a few of them. And I think that's awesome insight. I know that you're really focused on the marketing side and that's really your bread and butter, but I want to push a little bit on something that may not be necessarily your area of expertise. So you told me beforehand that you're sort of expanding into the whole scope of podcast production, maybe not necessarily just marketing. So give me just some high level thoughts on the importance of production value when it comes to show growth.
Well, I think, from our standpoint, we tend to focus on, we definitely want to make sure that the podcast is sounding well, right? Like, that's, there's a minimum threshold. Obviously, I don't know that we are as advanced as maybe someone, who's had your level of experience, but that is one bucket. But the other bucket that we look at are things like, content editing. And you've touched on a little bit on, like, the way that shows flow, right? And removing not only filler words or crutch words, but also, organizing interviews in a way that makes sense, and removing, rambling, and all of those kinds of things that make a more concise, easier, accessible, podcast. And so those are some of the other things when we think about production value, that we're incorporating into that. The other side of it that I think is a little bit missed is some of the small levers that, done consistently well, can really help with growth. And these are things like show notes, right? We've seen consistently that when we take over a show, one of the biggest thing, well, for sure the audio's quality goes up, but one of the biggest and the most drastic changes that we make is that we start doing pretty comprehensive show notes, or some, just well done show notes. And we can talk about what that means if you like, but we just see this small uptick as soon as we take over every single time. And it's just this small bit of growth. And the only thing that we can really attribute that to is some SEO, right? Because it's not like there's any spikes from guest sharing, or there's no real spikes. It's just, we start to see this slow growth. And so that's kind of what we've backhand, attributed to. And so those are the kind of the buckets when I think about, there's obviously some parts to, having a good interview, and, maybe the video aspect is a big part of it too. But when it comes to production value, those are kind of the three main categories that we look at.
I love that. Dive deeper into show notes. So what in your mind, so we've seen because show notes are something that are huge that I dive into all the time. So this is purely for, not only for the audience, but this is for my own, curiosity as well, is we've seen the standard shit show notes, which are, my name is host X, and today I interviewed this person and I copy and pasted their bio from their work website. you get handed those show notes. What do the Hector Santiesteban post magic show notes look like?
Hopefully they are like that. But we think about them in two ways, right? The first is they need to be readable, so that way when not everybody is going to read your show notes. Not everybody, but some people are, and especially new listeners, especially people who they're searching for something, they found your show, and it's a big commitment. It's a much bigger commitment to listen to a podcast than it is to watch a YouTube video, because when they're watching a YouTube video, oftentimes they're keeping the app open. Most people, or they have it up on their screen, and a new video is just one click away. When someone starts a podcast, they put their phone away, they start driving, they go on their jog, they start doing whatever it is their activity. So the switching cost of content, right, from episode to episode or video to video, and even the way that the players are formatted right now makes it really difficult. So that person who is looking for something new, you want to give them as many, from your episode art to your show title. But then the last layer that someone is going to kind of do to vet you is to read your show notes. And so we want to make that as helpful as possible for them to. You don't need to write a whole blog. You don't need the whole transcript. I wouldn't encourage that. But we want to have what we do is we have a summary, right? Like the closest thing would be like I liken it to like those 5th grade book reports that you would have to write. They were like one paragraph, summarize the book into 5 sentences. And it was like, that's kind of how we look at that initial paragraph. And ideally you want to fill that. And so that's the first part, is attracting, new listeners and making it helpful to understand. But the second thing is we want to fill up that with as many keywords and search terms that someone may be looking for, because not every platform weights the show notes as high as others for search, but it's definitely, some of them do. And so there are ways to do this wrong where it's just dropping a bunch of keywords in there, but you want to make sure that you're including the topics that are in there, so that if someone is searching for that stuff, that those are included in the paragraph. Or throughout it, right? So the second part is under the paragraph, we have a as detailed as possible list of I've learned recently that not including timestamps on the show notes has actually increased listen through performance. But we do have and that's something we're changing as of last week. But we always have a bulleted list of as many of the topics that we cover, and we do it for YouTube as well, because YouTube uses those as chapters, and so we put those timestamps into the YouTube description. But as far as the podcast, we're just listing as many different topics. Usually 7 to 10 different topics that they cover, along with all the links and resources and things like that. So that's kind of the basis. I can talk. Well, let me actually add one more thing. So the links and resources is helpful. I think one other thing that a lot of people miss, and especially businesses, is what are called backlinks. And when you put, Google is looking for, when they're looking to rank your website, they're looking to see how many other people are talking about you. And what's really cool about podcasting is podcasting gets distributed to 16 different platforms along with those show notes. So if you can put your website into the show notes, you can actually get your website link posted onto those 15 different websites. And that's going to tell Google that website is a little bit more valuable. And so when you do that for every episode, now you can collectively start to build your own website rank as well. And so we try and include as many of those relevant links. Not all of them are going to, juice, what's called juicing your domain. But that's kind of I don't want to call it a ninja tactic, but something that I think also helps over the long term as well.
I love that. With the show notes, with the time codes, I'm intrigued. Did you find that people, it increased the consumption rate because people didn't have the ability anymore to jump to only the sections they wanted to listen to? Interesting. Okay. That's a new way of approaching it, because I'm huge on the time codes thing, because I go for it because I want people to only listen to the parts that I listen to. Like, for example, do you know the Ringer podcast network?
I'm not familiar with it.
So Bill Simmons.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I know Bill Simmons. I didn't know that was his name of his podcast network. But yes.
So do you know Ryan Russillo, his buddy?
Yes.
So the Ryan Russillo podcast, I'm not a big football guy. Love basketball. So if they're doing a basketball topic, I'll listen to that one. But the one topic I listen to on every single episode is their life advice section. And it's time coded out. And I always jump to the life advice section because it's so entertaining. And I think I do not have firsthand knowledge on this, but from when I started listening about a year ago to now, they didn't have sponsors for each segment. Now I think they're seeing in their data that the life advice section is getting so much traction over the rest of the episode in terms of consumption that they're getting 2, 3, 4 sponsors for that segment specifically. So it used to just be like, welcome to Life Advice with Ryan Russillo. Here's our email to send it in. Now here's welcome to Life Advice presented by Modelo. They'll answer one question and then he'll go, Life Advice is brought to you by Snickers, blah, 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 blah. And so I think that's just kind of an interesting little wrinkle. So I'd be curious to follow up in a little bit how that change on your end is affecting things, because clearly, I mean, more consumption is good. You want people to consume more of the podcast. So it's an interesting approach to it.
Well, what you bring up is that, I think you're playing with perhaps two, hopefully mutually exclusive kind of, data points, which is downloads, right? Almost discoverability, and listener finish rate, which is what specifically Tracy Hazard, who is the founder of Podetize, and she has her own hosting platform. So they're really able to see a lot of that data. And that's what, what it did to their number of downloads. I would be curious to see that, because that's not something she emphasized. What she was emphasizing was the listen through rate, which at least right now to kind of for the listeners is like, I don't know that is as valuable as it is on YouTube. On YouTube, they're really looking for that, that people to watch through the whole video. On Apple, I don't know. I mean, maybe they're looking at that follow through rate, but that would be something to consider too.
Yeah, I totally agree. It is definitely an interesting discussion that is worthy of more time dedicated to it. I'm going to wrap it up on one question. Hector, marketing your podcast. You are now put in a position where you can only choose one marketing tactic going forward to promote podcasts. One is word of mouth marketing, and 2 is paid media advertising. Which one are you choosing and why?
Word of mouth. It's cheaper, it's more sustainable, and it's more authentic. Before you gave those options, I was going to go with guesting or podcast, utilizing guests and kind of leveraging other podcast hosts and kind of going on other shows, because I think that's the best one, right? And so if you can leverage word of mouth, people who are already, if someone can put you on or recommend you, then I think that's going to be the most powerful thing.
Hector, this was awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today. Where can people find you online? Plug your podcast, give them the whole shebang. Yeah,
thanks for letting me ramble for probably way longer than most of these episodes are. Twitter @Hector_podcast. If you guys are on LinkedIn, you guys can search me, Hector Santiesteban, and then the show is Marketing Your Podcast.
Thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider following the show, subscribe on YouTube, and I'll see you next week.